Hello, welcome back to the Bio 122 lecture videos. We're starting a new chapter. This is chapter 33 on the animal body, basic form and function. This is video 9, where we're going to talk specifically about body plans. But before we start talking about this video, this chapter, the three major topics we're going to cover is, first of all, symmetry in body plans. Video 10, the next video in this series, is going to talk about animal tissues. And then video 11, which would be the last part of this chapter, is going to talk about homeostasis and thermal regulation. So of those three aspects, the first one being symmetry in body plans, we've already talked about symmetry. It was covered in the previous chapter thoroughly, and you did your first diversity lab looking at symmetry. So just a reminder, we have animals with asymmetry, radial symmetry, and bilateral symmetry. But when we talk about overall body plans, we can also talk about the particular shapes of animals. And it's important to think about this in the context of evolution, because one of the things that is important in evolution is that sometimes we get what's called convergent evolution, which means that the animals have a similar appearance today, but there's actually not a common ancestor. This is also referred to as analogous similarity, and we discussed this in the previous chapter when talking about how the phylogenetic charts can sometimes be misleading, because if we only compare the morphology. Because one of the constraints on the shape of animals, the morphology of animals, is the laws of physics. If we look at these three animals that live in water, they all have a very similar shape. Here is a seal, and notice it has this kind of, this very nice shape designed for being fast and efficient underwater. That's not unlike the penguin, which also has this particular shape. And it's also really important to avoid any bumps on the surface. And this is extremely important when living in water, because water is so much denser than air. Any little bump, any little sharp edge is going to create quite a bit of drag, which means that you have to exert so much more force to move in water. And you know that. Most of you have all been in a swimming pool, and you cannot move in water nearly as fast as you can in air. And this is also shown in the tuna, also with this same basic body shape and very smooth surfaces and fins. But the strange thing is, while you might assume that all these animals must have evolved from a common ancestor, we know, have completely different ancestry, because the seal is a mammal. Inside the fin here of a seal is all the structures of a bones, the bones of the arm and the leg, that any land mammal would have. And we actually know from fossil evidence and current morphological evidence that seals evolved from animals that used to live on land and actually moved back into the seas and have lost the land-based limbs, but the remnants of them are still seen in their skeletal structure. And so the seal ancestors are mammals that did not look like this at all. Likewise, the penguin is a bird. And birds evolved from reptiles that did not look like this. And this is a unique solution to the problem that the penguins, which are birds that move back into the water, that live at least part-time in the water. Compare that with the tuna, which is a fish, which has ancestry that never left the water. Both the penguin and the seal have ancestors that used to live on land. And both the penguin and seal part-time live on land today. but they all have the same shape. So we can't always assume that similarity in shape is related to their evolutionary history, but it also shows why does all of these possibilities, why are they so similar? And the reason is the laws of physics of moving through water are the same. And so the efficiency of moving through water is going to dictate you're going to have the same basic shape. The same is true for the wings of birds, the wings of insects, the wings of bats. And I showed you that in the previous chapter. So all of those are because of the laws of physics. Now, another basic principle that defines animal shapes and the organ systems is the fact that, well, all life is based on single cells. That's the basic unit of life. And if we only have a single cell organism, well, the only way for them to get nutrients is through diffusion with the environment. And that's why single cell organisms always will live on water. But the other important thing to note about cells, and we would have covered this in Bio 121 or Bio 1, wherever you took that, is that the size of a cell is relatively consistent because laws of physics related to diffusion constrain the total size of a cell. Because as a cell gets larger and larger, the total surface area increases much faster than, the total volume increases much larger or much faster than the total surface area. And the thing is, the total volume means that there is more metabolism going on in that cell, but the only place for it to exchange nutrients with the environment is through the cell surface. And so we refer to this as the surface area to volume ratio. And as cells get bigger and bigger and bigger, that volume, that ratio gets less and less and less. That's a bad thing, because what ends up happening is that in larger cells, as shown over here on the right-hand side of this figure, as a cell gets larger, there is more metabolism going on in it, but we actually are unable to move in nutrients and move out waste products fast enough to support life. So larger cells don't end up being efficient or really capable of supporting life. Therefore, when we talk about a larger organism, like us, like humans, like elephants, it's not that we have larger cells than a smaller organism. It's just that we have more cells. So the concept of multicellularity becomes important in creating larger organisms. It's essential because all cells are pretty much the same size. And that leads to some other issues that are important in larger organisms. Because if we look at the left side here, which again is just a single-celled organism like a protist, this is got its nucleus over here and it's doing metabolism, and it just has to exchange nutrients directly with the environment. So it's taking nutrients in from the water surrounding it, and it's removing waste products that would be toxic to it out into the environment. And so it's a very simple notion of how a single cell exchanges with its environment. But it also is why all these single cell organisms have to be in water, because that's how they're diffusing things back and forth. Now, if we look at animals over here, and here's a simple animal, the hydra, but it's a multi-celled organism. But the hydra is constrained to be very small. These are barely visible to the naked eye. And well, it only has 2 layers of tissue because that is still efficient enough that if we look at an individual cell making either the ectoderm here or the endoderm, forming the gastrovascular cavity in here. Um, the cells are still exchanging directly with their environment, but notice their total area exposed to the environment is already much less than a single cell, which has the entire three-dimensional structure of the cell exposed. But now, this is already starting to reach the limit to what we can do with just direct exchange. So, organisms like this, animals like this, are always going to be very, very small. So how are we going to become a large organism? Well, we need to find another way to try to maximize our exposure to the environment. So one solution that some animals come up with is making yourself still very thin so that the nutrients don't have far to diffuse, but make yourself very long so that you have lots of surface area. That is exactly the solution done by animals such as tapeworms, these very, very flat animals that can become very, very long. These can become several meters long. They live in the intestines of other animals. It's a parasite, so it's simply taking advantage of the food that the larger animal is eating, and they are just absorbing nutrients directly into their body, therefore robbing their host animal of nutrients, which is why tapeworms lead to nutritional deficits. But for them, it's a great way of life. Make yourself very, very flat, give yourself plenty of opportunity to diffuse things between yourself and the environment, and that's a good solution. So this can become a very, very large animal in length, but they're still only a few cell layers thick. So very, very thin, but extremely long. However, for most animals, a different solution exists. So to become very, very large like us, or an elephant, or an giraffe, something like that, the only way that complex multicellular animals can solve this problem of exchanging materials with the environment is to increase your internal surface area. So this ends up being the topic of the rest of the course, because here in this diagram, we see that one thing that we can do is, instead of just absorbing food through our skin, which also puts us at great risk because that would also expose us to all sorts of viruses and bacteria and parasites, what we do is we make a very small opening, the mouth, and then we make an extremely long tube that passes through the body. But even more so, if we microscopically zoom in on the details of the lining of the digestive tract, over here on the bottom left-hand side is what it looks like with a scanning electron microscope. These are much smaller than cells. These are called microvilli. These are structures on the surface of individual cells. So instead of simply having flat cell surfaces, the cells that line your small intestine have enormous numbers of these small hills, these small outcroppings that greatly increase the surface area. So there's more space for absorption to occur. In fact, if you were to take a human intestinal tract, just the small intestine, and flatten it out so that each of these villi that line the small intestine are just all laid out flat side by side, the entire human intestine would be about the size of a tennis court. But instead, it's obviously in a much smaller tube, but these folds greatly increase the surface area while allowing it to fit into a smaller volume. And that solution is repeated in several ways. If we look at the respiratory system, which is another chapter we'll be exploring, air comes in, carbon dioxide goes out, and we're going to exchange that with the blood. And if we look at the alveoli of the lung tissue, again, what we're going to see is a really, really large surface area because there's a whole lot of little pockets. This is much more efficient than just a smooth surface. So we're going to continuously solve this problem by creating increased surface area. And if we look at the kidneys, so the excretion system, and that's another chapter we'll be studying, if we look at how we're going to be diffusing waste products out of the blood, the bottom right down here shows how blood vessels surround the glomerulus of the kidneys, of the nephrons in the kidneys, and greatly increase the total surface area at which waste products can be extracted and filtered out of the blood. Every time we're looking at this, whether it's the digestive system, respiratory system, or the excretion system, we are increasing internal surface area in order to maximize our exchange of materials. Finally, the other part that we need is that we need to distribute these throughout the body. And so this is a depiction of the circulatory system, which is going to be picking nutrients up from the digestive tract, also picking up oxygen from the respiratory system while depositing the waste product carbon dioxide into the lungs, and then passing the blood with waste materials to the kidneys so that the excretory system can remove the toxic waste out of the body, and then we remove it totally from the body as metabolic waste. So what we have here is the solution that large complex animals have developed in order to solve this dilemma of exchange with the environment is to create complex organ systems. So this is going to be the topic of the rest of the course. So that's the end of this section. The next thing we're going to cover are the different animal tissues. See you in the next video.